morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio, the podcast where we talk with writers about their lives, their craft, their business, and their latest work. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and our podcast is sponsored by Bookmarks. Bookmarks is a literary nonprofit whose programs include the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas. Come visit Bookmarks at our community gathering space and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Inside the Writer's Studio is also proud to be an affiliate of Libro FM, the audiobook platform that supports your local independent bookstore. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast for more information on Libro FM and a special offer. My guest today is Julie Soto, whose novel Forget Me Not was featured at this year's Bookmarks Festival. Julie, welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as we say in our intro, this podcast is really an outgrowth of Bookmarks, the literary nonprofit here in Winston-Salem. We do year-round events. We have the bookstore, but we also host this huge book festival that we just had in spite of somewhat gloomy weather this past weekend. And we had a chance to meet and talk there a little bit before this podcast. But I'd love to ask you, as an author visiting Winston-Salem, what were your impressions of Bookmarks? How did the festival go for you?
Bookmarks was fabulous. I have only been to two organized festivals slash conventions. As an author, as a fan, I've been to others, but and so it was, and both of them have been very well run. But I was just out. I was completely losing words. I was completely taken aback by how well the festival was organized, and in particular, the transportation. There's so many different things that the festival organizes for publicity or for connecting to the community or outreach, and there's transportation for the authors to all of it. Even just basically walking out of the hotel while it's so rainy on the day of the panels and the sightings and seeing that there's a golf cart that we could take, I was like, oh, thank God. That was great for my hair.
Yeah, it was probably not a great hair day for a lot of people, but we were, we were so pleased that so many people were able to turn out for the festival. It didn't feel like the weather really dampened things at all. I mean, it did literally, but not figuratively.
Yeah. I didn't think the turnout was affected much at all. I think they had that great event on Friday evening for Books and Bites. I believe it was the first of its kind, and I hope they keep doing it because it was a great chance for people to kind of get in an air-conditioned indoor space and to chat with their favorite authors.
Yeah, that was the first time we've done that, and I think from all I've heard, it was a huge hit. I was behind somebody going into one of the venues on Saturday, and this Books and Bites event was Friday night, where you had a chance to meet authors and get your book signed. And the people in front of me in line said, "Oh, that was the best money I've ever spent, was my ticket for Books and Bites."
That's great. Yeah.
So, both of us are theater enthusiasts. We've both been actors and singers. We've both been playwrights. Tell us a little bit about your personal history in the theater and sort of how you went from that to writing romance novels.
Yeah. Well, it's not linear, that's for sure. But I started doing theater when I was 6 or 7 years old, and just local community theater, but it was actually a very well-established company in Sacramento. And I was doing theater up until college. I went to Cal State Fullerton in Southern California for musical theater, and was basically, I transferred out of that school after a couple years and went back home to Sacramento and finished with a BA in theater and a minor in creative writing. And I did not think at the time that the minor in creative writing was going to be for creative writing and theater. But it was just something I'd been interested in, and I wanted more. I guess I didn't even have plans to be writing novels back then. It was just something I wanted more training in back then. So a little over 10 years ago, I started working on a a musical with a set of friends. And it's basically, I was running a children's theater company in Sacramento, with a friend of mine, and we were, using our kids to stage this new musical. So we worked on it for about 8 years, and we took it through the festival circuits. It went through the LA Fringe, the New York Fringe, and then the New York Musical Festival. And it won top place at the New York Musical Festival, and I got an award for best book. So it was great. It I didn't have a ton of ideas for musicals. It wasn't something that I was like, and then the next musical we write together will be this. But I was just very focused on creating that at that one time. And then with the pandemic, around 2020, that was when, we had some options for what to do with the musical next, but 2020 kind of wiped all of that clean in a way. So really, I started writing fan fiction back in 2017, which is, if you don't know what fan fiction is, it is online writing for a fandom, like taking an existing property like Star Wars, like Game of Thrones, and writing in that sandbox, kind of creating your own stories, or, you know, if a character references a scene that took place off page, you maybe want to write that scene and see how that would have unfolded. So it's a free community type of writing in a way. You don't get paid from it at all. And so I was writing fan fiction starting in 2017. So by the time 2020 rolled around, I had gotten a pretty big following there. And I had gotten probably 700,000 words under my belt for for writing for fandom in, I would call it novel format, but it's very Dickens like, where it was published periodically, chapter by chapter. So basically, when the pandemic started, the easiest thing to do was sit alone in your room with one task.
Yeah.
So I started kind of shifting my focus to what could I do with novel writing, and started working on books that I could query to agents. And that's kind of my progress. I feel like the transition from theater to novel writing really just started as a hobby with the fan fiction. And by way of the pandemic, novel writing fiction is collaborative at a certain point, but not in the beginning. Whereas I think theater in the beginning, it's you can write the play alone in your room, but the next step is getting it on its feet. And there's that step isn't there in fiction writing. And I think it was an easier way of figuring out how to move forward in the pandemic.
So let's have a little lesson here, because you were on the romance panel with Abby Jimenez and Dominique Lynn, which, by the way, was a standing room only panel. I think it was about as packed as I've ever seen that room. It was just great.
It was amazing. Yeah.
So what makes a book a romance as opposed to there happen to be two people in this book who end up together at the end of the book?
Yeah, I think there are two elements, what I've heard officially in the community. One is that it has to have a happy ending, a happily ever after, where the characters are together. And secondly, the main plot of the story revolves around the love story. So there's always generally a secondary plot of, career or family or something that influences the love story plot line, but the main objective of telling the book is watching the people fall in love. I think those are the two qualifiers, and that's how, some people say in some ways a lot of Nicholas Sparks books don't count as romances under those circumstances, and certain other books that have a more heavy influence on plot, the exterior plot, and it's the romance is the side story, wouldn't necessarily qualify as a romance. But I think it's a very broad genre. But in terms of when people are looking for something specific, in the same way that they look for mysteries and thrillers specifically, that there's a specific thing they want, they're going for those two qualifiers, that it has a happily ever after and that it's about falling in love.
And I think most of us know that generally, I mean, I'm generalizing here, but typically a romance involves two people meeting, falling in love, breaking up, and then getting back together. That's a sort of
Yeah.
standard format. And as you say, that love story is at the forefront. Now, I found when I was writing plays for children, I had to write within very specific parameters. I was writing for a specific number of children, a specific gender breakdown. I wanted all the kids to have this basically the same size part. The play couldn't, was supposed to be a certain length. And what I discovered was working within a preordained structure actually sort of liberated me creatively. And I'm curious to know if you find that same thing in working with romance, where there's certain things that are expected. If it actually, do you find it limits you or it sort of opens you up?
I want to make one comment on theater, since we're both theater people.
Sure.
My uh my director mentor, who was mentoring me while I was trying to study directing, he used to tell this story that he was doing a production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, which has 6 characters, and he asked the set design to only give him 5 blocks so that he could never fall back on, and all 6 of them stand on their blocks,
Right.
And I just thought that was such a great way to push yourself out of the structure. Like, there is a structure, but you find your own workaround of it. You take away an element, or you put an element in that will force you to do better work. But to that point, the what you're talking about with romance, I find it's very freeing, because when you know that it's going to end in a happily ever after, for some reason the readers still do want to read and make sure that it will become a happily ever after, that you didn't lie to them. And I think that's beautiful, that there's still, if you know the ending of a thriller, rarely, unless the storytelling or the narrative device is specific, rarely do you care to keep going if it gets, quote unquote, spoiled for you. But in romance, you're spoiled from the minute you walk into that section of the bookstore. And so I think that's very freeing in a way, because then you're looking at how to use the different variables of the plot in completely different ways. Like, you're not trying to one up your last book and say they're going to fall in love harder. It's they're just it's how do these two people with these two sets of problems and backstories. I kind of think romance is very character driven, more character driven than other genres specifically for that.
Yeah, I think the word how is really key here, that it becomes more about how does it happen rather than what is going to happen. I'm reminded of a book from years ago by a guy named Howard Norman, The Bird Artist, which is a murder mystery, but he states in the first paragraph who got killed, who killed him, and so who done it, but the whole question is why and how, and that becomes the driving question behind the book. I always learn so much when I attend these romance panels like the one you were here at Bookmarks. And most of us, if we are novelists, even if we're not aware of it, even if we're not writing in a particular genre, we're still using these sort of tried and true storytelling structures and techniques and tropes. We may not think about it, but we are. But romance novelists not only think about it, they talk about it. And they have names for all these tropes, which I think is so cool. And you go in there and you hear them talking about only one bed and the knight in shining armor, and my brain is like trying to figure out exactly what they mean. Tell us a little bit about about this idea of tropes and maybe what a couple of your favorite ones are in the romance world.
Yeah, tropes I think get so broadened. That idea is so broad nowadays, and because it's almost like there should be a trope tree where there's a branch of this and here's how it branches off into different sections of that.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like a lot of tropes in romance at least start with like, is it an opposites attract book? And that is a super broad, people don't even use that as a trope because underneath it you have grumpy and sunshine, which means that there's one character who is scowly and wears black, and the other character is bubbly. Um, and then there's enemies to lovers, which is also something that's used so broadly when, most of the time maybe they're rivals to lovers or they just get off on the wrong foot. But in general, it creates that narrative tension that we know as enemies to lovers. And then there's also things like childhood best friends, that perhaps has some kind of like a second chance romance thing to it, where they were together when they were teenagers and then they come back together later in life. So I think I think it's because romance is so structured that we find those tropes and we name them in the way that like, well, if I already know it's going to have a happy ending, here's the type of thing I want to find in this book. So some of my favorite tropes, I love all enemies to lovers and everything that encompasses, even if it's just opposites attract. It's generally just that Pride and Prejudice beginning is is what I look for. Um, and I love there's also specific tropes that aren't don't even cover the entire book. It just covers like a chapter of the book. And it's almost like a little spoiler that you can, or a teaser you can give the audience, like the idea that they're going to, they need to go to a hotel for one night for some reason. Maybe they're stranded. Maybe they have a conference together. And when they check in, they've lost the second room reservation. And now it's, oh, and we're all sold out tonight. We just have this one room with one bed. And it's so that's the only one bed
Right.
trope, is that they're going to find themselves needing to share a bed. And even if nothing happens in that bed, even if like he's a gentleman and takes the floor or takes the armchair, like just the idea that they have to discuss how to move forward with only one bed is an attractive thing to a lot of readers. So I like only one bed. I think it's funny when it's done differently in different ways. There's a book called Pride and Protest by Nikki Payne, where I think that they're snowed into a like a office, a very fancy office building, and they have some of those like sleep pods that like people can like take naps in during the day. I don't know, very, very fancy office building. And they're snowed into it. And like the joke is like only one sleep pod, and like these two people have to share a sleep pod. And it's like it's a variation of a very common trope, but it's done hilariously. And so I think that's the thing with tropes, is that when it comes with the romance structure, you want to find the different ways of bleeding to that happy ending.
Yeah.
And also I think it comes into marketing too. At the end of the day, you want to be able to tell your readers what tropes are in your book, even if you didn't write with that intention.
Yeah, and I think about my own novels, and some of them have a romantic element, and some of them don't. But I very much like the enemies to lovers, or specifically, I mean, I think about in the Lost Book of the Grail. You have these two characters who she's all about technology and scanning books and digital this and digital that, and he wants a card catalog and old manuscripts. And I like the idea of two characters who, on the surface of it, you just would never see them together, because
Yeah.
then that makes for a challenging and interesting story, as opposed to two characters who, oh, well, obviously they were going to end up together. They're perfect for each other. Where's the fun in
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah. The narrative tension, I think, is so much. I personally don't read a lot of friends to lovers, because I just think it's, more tense and delicious when they either start with a misunderstanding or, like you said, there's some intrinsic thing they cannot agree upon, and you watch them evolve either as humans or in their opinions. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your new novel, Forget Me Not.
Yeah. So Forget Me Not is a second chance romance. So one of the tropes
Yeah.
is second chance romance. It is about a young up and coming wedding planner named Amma who gets the opportunity to work on the wedding of her career. It's a celebrity wedding. It'll be covered by one of the TLC shows. It'll be huge for her kind of fledgling wedding business. The only catch is that the couple has already decided on their florist, and it's the man whose heart she broke 2 years ago. So between the two of them, they have to pretend that they never dated, pretend that, of course, we always work together. We haven't ignored each other for 2 years in this professional industry. And so it has grumpy sunshine, like I mentioned before, second chance romance, and it's a little bit of enemies to lovers because they didn't get off on the right foot when they first met. So yeah, that's Forget Me Not.
And now you mentioned when we talked at Books and Bites that is there a Jane Austen connection in this novel?
There
In
is.
a
It
way?
is basically, yeah, it's a persuasion retelling.
Yeah.
So that's definitely my tied for first place of my favorite Jane Austen books between Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion. And it's very, if you know Persuasion very well, I haven't even talked about it a lot, but like a lot of the pieces are very thinly coated with like the Musgroves are in there that you may not notice unless you look for it as a Persuasion adaptation.
Yeah. I have to say, my dad taught Jane Austen for 40 years, and Persuasion was
Yeah.
his favorite novel.
Yeah.
And of course, I wrote First Impressions, which is a book partly about Jane Austen, about the writing of Pride and Prejudice. So I think there's such a deep mind there, isn't there, with
Yeah.
Austen's works?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that. I mean, between her and Shakespeare, I think they started all of the tropes.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't hit a trope. You can't throw a dart at a trope without hitting Shakespeare or Jane Austen. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah. Now, when you were here for Bookmarks, one of the things you did was we have an authors in schools program, and you didn't go into an elementary school. You actually went to a university seminar on romance and Jane Austen. So tell us a
Yes.
bit about that experience. What was it like to bring your experience as both a Jane Austen lover and a writer of modern romances into a college seminar setting?
I loved that. I went with Dominic Lim, who is another author I was sharing the panels with, author of All the Right Notes. And I wanted the syllabus for that class. I'm like, what books are you reading? Tell me what you're discussing, because it was just fascinating to me. And what I loved was that there were 20, maybe 25 college students in there, and I was told when I got there that they actually are all working on creative writing projects as well. So it wasn't simply just a seminar in studying, but also in learning about writing romance. And so that was fabulous to be able to talk about the industry too. So in terms of, we didn't talk too much about Jane Austen, which I was terribly upset about. But it was nice to talk to young students, young readers, and about what kind of questions they have going into things, and what it's been like for Dominic and I in the industry so far. We both had our debuts this year, so it's very fresh in our heads. But I could just tell that they were voracious romance readers, and like some of them had read my fan fiction too, so
Right.
it was fun. It was fun to like connect with them on that. But yeah, that was such a unique opportunity. I loved being able to go in and steal part of their Friday.
Yeah, I think that was so great that I mean, it just seems like the perfect class for you to show up for.
Yeah.
Now, so as you said, Amma is a wedding planner. Now, I'm not going to call myself an expert on wedding planning, but I have a daughter who's been a professional wedding planner for at least a decade or so. So I probably know more about wedding planning than your average 61-year-old man, and I've certainly heard some
Yeah.
stories. So other than attending weddings, how did you discover that world? Because I gotta say, I mean, even just that first couple chapters where she's running the wedding, I mean, I saw Jordan all over that. It's like I've heard her talk about that sort of problem solving on the fly and everything.
Yeah. I think a lot of that specifically came from theater.
Hmm.
And I used to stage manage, I used to run the light board, I used to call the show in a lot of different types of theater, from professional down to community theater. So for me, my theater background was really imperative in that type of thing. And also I rewatched The Wedding Planner with J Lo. And I just thought it was so great. If you rewatch it, the very first scene, it shows her comedically solving a crisis.
Yeah.
Like there's a specific, if it's been forever, I understand, but like she's in a church trying to get to the front row, going along the sides, and in between pillars of the church, she has to walk slowly so people don't see she's running. But every time she hits a pillar, you see her speed up, speed up, speed up. And then she slows down, and and it was just so comedic, but she's a good wedding planner. You show in chapter one or for the movie in scene one, she's a good wedding planner. Um, and so for me, I did a ton of research, but truly I had a friend who had worked in the wedding industry in a similar position to what Amma used to do before she started her own company, and had similar experiences to what Amma went through. And so I asked her a lot of questions. I ran a lot of ideas by her. I needed in the beginning, I needed like ideas of like how often she and Elliot, the love interest, were going to be running into each other. Like when you connect over the floral design, when's the next time you see them? And when she was like, not very soon, I was like, great. What kind of problems arise? And it was just great to like to spitball, like she's a writer herself, so I was able to be like, how could I force them together sooner? And it was really helpful. I also spoke to a friend of mine who runs an event venue in Sacramento, and Sacramento is where the book takes place. So she was able to kind of further answer some questions that are like very Sacramento based, and you know, at a point, without giving spoilers, Amma is creating a reception venue from scratch. And I was asking my friend who's an event coordinator at her venue, this is what I'm thinking for what she's doing. And she was like, wow, if that actually existed in Sacramento, I would be put out of business. And I was like, oh, good. Then this sounds desirable to people in the wedding industry. And I know I got things wrong. I know that things are, I was liberal in certain areas, but I've heard from wedding planners and people in the industry who say it felt like it reflected their experience, and that's all I care about.
Yeah, I think what you say about theater is so true. Our daughter was a theater major in college, and I think if you, especially when you're running day of, that's
Yeah.
stage manager. It's the same exact job, you know.
Yeah. I've had theater productions where we're rehearsing a number that we've never run. Like we're getting choreography half an hour before the curtain.
Goodness.
It's just like, yes, certain just really terrible. So as an actor, that's awful. And then later in life, set pieces breaking day of and trying to put them back together, like while the audience is coming into the theater. Yeah.
Yeah, I've worked at a theater where we were literally painting the set while the audience was filing in, and we had to tell the actors, okay, don't lean against that wall in the first act because it's still going to be wet.
It's still wet. Yeah.
So Emma says right up front in the first chapter that she's not interested in marriage for herself, even though she's a
Yeah.
wedding planner. She doesn't really believe in the success of long-term relationships. Why is she like that? And what does it do to her character that she always sees the wedding but never sees the marriage?
Yeah. I think that's the core of it too, is why she can still be such a good wedding planner, is that it's the marriage isn't her job, the party. She's an event coordinator, truly. She could properly run an anniversary party or a birthday party because she um is truly an event coordinator. She's not a marriage coordinator. So Emma's mother has been married 16 times when we meet Amma. And I wanted that number specifically because I wanted it on the right side of comedic. Like 11 for some reason was not comedic enough for me. Like that's actually, I could probably meet someone who's been married 11 times. There are probably some celebrities who are getting closer to that number. So 16 was comedic to me while also I think you can start to envision what kind of person that is. Um, for good or for bad. And I think Amma was raised in a household where marriage was not marriage was at least love was idealized for sure. Her mother fell in love a lot, and she chose to put that love towards marriage. And so Amma started to see that, well, once she got married, she fell out of love. So why would anyone sign a piece of paper that basically guarantees you're going to fall out of love one day? So and Amma's young. She's I think 26, 25, 26 when the story starts in the present. So she's still learning things about relationships and herself, I think. And so it was a really interesting dynamic to play with when it's happening more and more often in romances where the woman is more so the I don't want long-term commitment, and the man is the one who is like, we must get married, I want to marry you. It's kind of the role reversal of When Harry Met Sally, which is inspired my friend Kate Goldbeck's book You Again, which is exactly that. The woman is the Billy Crystal saying like men and women can't be friends. and the man is the Sally who's like, don't you want long-term commitment? Um, and so that was a really great thing to play with, also with her being a wedding planner.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that you begin with her 5 rules of wedding planning. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, okay, these are going to have to come, these are going to come back somehow, especially the one about don't be alone with a groomsman. Like that's got to be something there.
Yeah.
What how do you decide how to begin a book? I mean, they're not gonna meet in the first sentence. So you're
Yeah.
trying to establish character. How do you decide the best way to start?
I would say, I mean, I think a lot of people do it a lot of different ways. I was initially nervous not bringing in um Elliot into chapter 1 because a lot of times chapter 1 is the meet cute in romance, and you jump start the story essentially, but I wanted to see Amma in her element first. Like I said, you see J-Lo and she's a competent wedding planner. But I think, it's like in my second book, we meet the love interest in chapter 1. I think it varies. It's kind of I guess it's almost like case by case, because if you can find a way for them to meet each other and also be serving the overall plot, which for me was Emma is a wedding planner. She wants to be a more highly respected, highly paid wedding planner. Um, then then I think people do that more often. But I'd say that it's really case by case. And like, I think the first page, we all know as authors, the first page has to hook people. And sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. Sometimes it takes till page 5. Um, I'm rereading drafts of things that are going to go out soon. And I'm just like, I need to fix the first 10 pages for sure, but specifically page 1 has got to do better. And I think it's case by case like that.
Yeah, yeah. I always tell young authors. I mean, it's a cynical thing to say, but it's true that the primary purpose of page one is to get readers to read page two.
Yeah.
And you think if you think in those terms, and you do have to work hard on that first page. So I have to say, I mean, I've held this back for this whole conversation because I didn't want to put my favorite thing right up front. But how can you not love a book that has the line "Donuts are my love language"? I mean, that was just like, and there's a lot of funny stuff in this book. There's stuff in this book where my wife is like, "What are you laughing at over there in the corner?" Can you mentioned a little bit about with how many times the mom had been married, about sort of trying to get to that comedic edge. Can you talk about incorporating humor into the story, into character, in ways that keep it organic to the text rather than just, oh, we're going to stop and have a joke here?
Yeah, I think there's different types of humor in books and also in people. You know, I can think of three people in my life off the top of my head that could win a wit battle with Shakespeare himself, like who are just so quick and so educated without being arrogant. And they're just so much quicker than anyone else at turning phrases. And I feel like with humor in books, you there's not a slapstick element that there can be in visual mediums like theater and TV and film, where physical comedy has to be described. And I think for me at least, sometimes it just comes down to, is your POV character a funny person? And like a lot of the times, sometimes they're not. There's a lot of quirky characters in romance, because it helps with people's voice coming out and being able to like comment on things. But I would say for me, it was helpful for me that Amma was always going to be she's a funny person. She's quick and she surrounds herself with quick people. Um, and she also gets embarrassed in the same way that other people get embarrassed. So living through mortification with her becomes funny. Um, yeah, I would say Forget Me Not is definitely one of the funnier things that I've written. I'm already wondering if book two is even funny at all. But it definitely thank you for that. I'm very glad that her love of donuts and the comedy through it all came out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what you say about physical comedy is so true. Somebody slips and falls down on stage or in the film, and that can be hilarious. And you write about it, and it's just a person fell down and got hurt. There's nothing funny about it.
Yeah.
And so it does make it sort of limits you in some ways. But then, as you said, you can have this sort of verbal sparring. And
Yeah.
Emma has this tendency to become emotionally involved with her clients, and she says that always gets her into trouble when she blurs that line.
Yeah.
I think it's a very human dynamic. I mean, I've known it in my own life, the difficulty of separating what ought to be a business relationship from what feels more like a personal relationship, because you're working with someone that you happen to like. Um, and especially when your business relationship is orchestrating, the most emotional day of somebody's life,
Yeah.
that might happen. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic, in for her, and how it works or doesn't work in her life?
Yeah, I think there are some people that are just so endearing immediately upon meeting them in life, in real life, not in fiction. You immediate it was that Jennifer Lawrence effect right after Hunger Games when you started seeing her in interviews. You were like, "Oh my God, I want to be her best friend." And now it's kind of taken over with like the Taylor Swift effect too, of just like wanting to be close to that person. And I feel like there are people in real life, not just celebrities, who you hear them talk for 30 seconds and I want to know that person. I want to be better with them. And I think Amma falls into that category. But the problem is that she was mentored by a person who is extremely removed and looks at it as a business and is completely successful with that kind of model. So Amma, for the first 5 years of her training, as a wedding planner, was fighting her inner instincts of wanting to get to know the bride better and finding out, like, well, why are we using the color gray in June? What's special to you about gray? And in like trying to actually get to know them better so that she can design their wedding better and be a better coordinator for them too. But she has someone who's been her mentor who has been wildly successful doing the exact opposite. So I think it's about Amma finding her own line in the sand of what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and being able to walk that on her own. And of course, what happened with falling in love with Elliot 2 years ago when they had their previous relationship, it only reinforced her fears about it all. Like, I got too close to someone in my work life, and it ended horribly. Um, and I think so she has a lot of walls and barriers put up about that.
Now, I can't help but noticing, so this podcast, we're talking here on the 29th of September. This is going to go up on the 1st of October. This wedding that she's working on is next week, right? It's the 7th of
Yeah,
October,
October
2023.
7th.
I'm actually going to a wedding that day. I'm just
Fabulous.
so
Yeah.
so my question is, have you ever look at a wedding, go to a wedding with the same eyes that you had before you wrote this book?
I am going into my first wedding post. Is that true? First wedding post writing, definitely post the book coming out, but I think post, and if any one of my friends who has invited me to their wedding that I attended in the past 18 months, I'm very sorry. First wedding I'm attending at the end of October. Since writing the book. So I will let you know, because that's kind of like, that's such a specific, that question really resonates with me, because I remember the first time I took a lighting design class in theater. It was only as a 1 semester class, and it changed my entire view of how I attend theater. And, you see poorly designed, poorly lighting designed shows, possibly just because they don't have a lighting designer, they don't have equipment. They're a lower budget type of theater company or high school. And I would just go and I would be so upset. Like, my body would be itching because there's no light on the stage, or there's too much light on the stage, or the light is so hot on this one ensemble member that has nothing to do with the plot. And being able to direct the eye, learning what you're supposed to do in lighting design, and then going to see theater for the rest of your life and not being able to turn it off. It was such an eye-opening experience for me. And even now, like, when I walk into rooms, I know where the light's coming for, just normal rooms, non-theaters. Like, if there's a fluorescent that's blinking, so like in the books and bites room, some of the fluorescents were blinking. And I was like, oh God, someone fix the fluorescents. So I'm really interested to see if it'll be the same type of way with weddings, and how I view them, and what's different about different weddings, and how they structure, because not all weddings have to be structured in the same way.
Well, we like to end every episode of Inside the Writer's Studio with the same 10 questions. You should be able to answer each of them in just a couple of words, but hopefully they'll give us some insight into you and into your writing.
Okay.
What word do you love to work into your writing?
The one thing that comes to mind is I like to use non-verbs as verbs, like to steeple his fingers, things like that. So that's one of the ones that I feel like pops up often in my writing, steepled his fingers.
What word do you hate to encounter in other people's writing?
Now, since I'm a romance writer, it's a bit crass, but male genitalia in the medical terminology is not quite as appreciated.
Where's your favorite place to write?
Either in coffee shops, and specifically Black Fox Coffee Shop on Pine Street in New York.
Where could you never write?
Outdoors.
To what rule of grammar do you pay least attention?
Uh, Fragments, and specifically, I have like stage directions in my writing sometimes, like a sound to her left, like a tinkling bell, and you and there's no verb.
What's the first book you remember reading?
It's probably a Dr. Seuss, but the first thing I have a memory of reading and rereading was Ella Enchanted.
What are you reading now?
I am reading I'm reading Good Girl Bad Blood by Holly Jackson. It's the sequel to A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, and Regina Black's The Art of Scandal.
What book would you like to have written?
I'm very jealous of Station 11.
Oh,
I
yeah.
love it so much.
What
Yeah.
sort of book would you like to write, but probably never will?
Fantasy.
And finally, what would you like to hear a reader tell you?
Um, I love when readers who've read my fan fiction come up and tell me that they know me from fan fiction. That's my favorite thing.
This has been Inside the Writer's Studio. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and my guest today has been Julie Soto, whose novel Forget Me Not is available wherever books are sold. Julie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Inside the Writer's Studio is sponsored by Bookmarks, a literary nonprofit that runs the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas and operates a community gathering place and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. To find out more about Bookmarks and all its programs, visit www.bookmarksnc.org. Inside the Writer's Studio is proud to be affiliated with Libro FM. Unlike other audiobook platforms, Libro FM supports your local independent bookstore. Whether you buy a single book or, like me, a monthly subscription, you can link your account to your local store or to Bookmarks to support literary community. For a special 2-for-1 offer, go to libro.fm and use the discount code WRITERS. If you've enjoyed Inside the Writer's Studio, please consider leaving a rating or review online at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Inside the Writer's Studio posts new episodes on the 1st and 15th of every month. On our next episode, I'll be talking with another author from this year's Bookmarks Festival of Books and Authors. Until then, thanks for joining us, and may you read with wonder and write with passion.